There is a specific suffocating kind of silence that falls over a room full of billionaires when they see something they despise. It is not a gasp. It is a collective chilling sneer. When Clara stepped into the aisle of Boaz's most exclusive estate, she did not hear the triumphant ring of wedding bells. Instead, she heard the cruel echoing laughter of 300 elite guests mocking her unadorned yellowed wedding gown. To the high society crowd, she was just a penniless opportunist, ruining a dynastic bloodline, wearing what looked like a cheap thrift store nightgown. But the joke was entirely on them, because the fragile silk they were laughing at was not a budget compromise. It was a priceless piece of European history that was about to bring the entire room to its knees. Clara always knew that marrying Emir Karahan would come with a heavy price tag. She just didn't realize the currency would be her dignity. Emir was the heir apparent to Karahan Holding, a massive private equity firm rooted in old Istanbul money. His family didn't just have wealth, they had buildings named after them, a fleet of yachts, and an arrogant belief that they owned the world and everyone in it. Clara, on the other hand, lived a quiet life in Boston, working as an archival restorer for rare manuscripts. She drove a 10-year-old sedan, rented a modest apartment, and never spoke about her family. To the Karahans, she was a nobody, a charity case, a temporary lapse in Emir's otherwise impeccable judgment. What nobody in the Karahan family knew, not even Emir, was that Clara's full legal name was Her Serene Highness Princess Clara of the House of Hesse-Darmstadt. She was a direct descendant of European royalty, a bloodline woven into the very fabric of history. Her family had fled political upheaval decades ago, abandoning their titles to live peacefully and anonymously in America. Clara was taught by her late grandmother, Grand Duchess Adelheid, that true nobility was in character, not in crowns, and certainly not in bank accounts. Clara took this to heart, bearing her royal lineage so deeply that her friends just knew her as Clara Hayes, the quiet bookworm with an impeccable posture. The friction with Emir's family began the moment the diamond slipped onto her finger. Nihal Karahan, Emir's mother, was a woman who viewed life as a series of hostile takeovers. She was terrifyingly perfectly groomed with eyes as cold as the diamond she wore to breakfast. "We will of course be hosting the wedding at the Boaz estate," Nihal had announced over a tense dinner, not asking, but dictating. "And I have already taken the liberty of arranging your bridal fittings at Leblanc. We cannot have you walking down the aisle looking like a public school teacher, Clara." Clara had tried to maintain her composure. "Nihal, I appreciate the gesture, but I actually have a dress, a family heirloom." Nihal paused, her wine glass hovering near her lips. She let out a laugh that sounded like, "Oh, Clara, sweetheart. We are expecting the Vali, 3 Bakanla, and the board of directors. You cannot wear some moth-eaten rag your grandmother stitched together during the Depression. You will wear custom couture, or you will embarrass us all." To keep the peace, Clara agreed to attend the fitting. It was a spectacular disaster. Nihal had not only rented out the entire boutique, but she had also invited Selina Carr to act as a style consultant. Selin was a towering blonde socialite and Emir's former flame, a woman Nihal desperately wished was wearing the engagement ring instead of Clara. For 3 agonizing hours, Nihal and Selin forced Clara into monstrous, suffocating gowns covered in thousands of Swarovski crystals, heavy tulle, and ostentatious lace. "This one is acceptable," Selim purred, adjusting a 50-pound dress that made Clara look like a frosted cupcake. "It distracts from your lack of presence, Clara. You need something loud so people don't wonder why Emir settled." Nihal nodded in agreement. "It's 25 TL, Clara. A drop in the bucket for us, but I suppose it's the most expensive thing you'll ever touch." "We'll take it." "No," Clara said, her voice soft but entirely immovable. The room fell dead silent. Nihal turned, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" "I said no," Clara repeated, stepping off the pedestal. She carefully unzipped the heavy couture gown. "I am not wearing this. I am wearing my family's dress. It means more to me than any price tag." Nihal's face flushed with a terrifying venomous rage. "If you walk down the aisle in some cheap pathetic rag, Clara, do not expect me to pretend I am happy about this union. You will be a laughingstock, and I will let them laugh." Clara changed back into her simple jeans and sweater, her heart pounding but her resolve hardening. She didn't need thousands of crystals. She had history. She had the legacy of queens. She just hoped Emir would understand. The weekend of the wedding arrived with the force of a hurricane. The Boaz estate was swarming with florists, caterers, and armed security. Clara felt like an intruder in her own love story. Emir was pulled in 100 different directions by his overbearing father and business associates, leaving Clara to navigate the shark-infested waters of the Karahan social circle alone. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Boaz Royal Yacht Kulübü, a venue that dripped with exclusivity. Clara wore a simple, elegant navy slip dress. It was understated and refined, but in a sea of women wearing runway labels and diamond parures, she looked starkly out of place. Selina Carr arrived 30 minutes late, intentionally making an entrance. She was wearing a breathtaking custom crimson gown that looked more suited for a Met Gala red carpet than a rehearsal dinner. She immediately gravitated toward the center of the room, loudly holding court, making sure everyone noticed her. Clara stood near the balcony doors, clutching a glass of sparkling water, trying to remain invisible. The whispers were not subtle. "Look at her." A woman dripping in emeralds hissed to her companion, intentionally loud enough for Clara to hear. "She doesn't even know which fork to use for the oysters." Nihal is beside herself. "I give it 2 years." The companion replied, sipping her champagne. "Emir will get bored of playing savior to the working class. She's completely, utterly unremarkable." Clara took a deep breath, staring out at the dark Bosphorus. True nobility is in character, she reminded herself, hearing her grandmother's German-accented voice in her head. "Enjoying the view, Cinderella?" Clara turned to see Céline standing there, a cruel smirk playing on her crimson lips. "It's a beautiful night, Céline," Clara said evenly. Céline took a slow, deliberate sip of her drink, looking Clara up and down. "You know Nihal is practically having a nervous breakdown over your little dress rebellion. I saw the garment bag you brought in. It looks like it holds a curtain." "It's not too late, Clara. I brought a backup gown Vera Wang never worn. I can have my maid bring it to your suite." "I don't need your charity, Céline," Clara replied, her voice remaining perfectly steady. "It's not charity, darling. It's damage control." Céline laughed a sharp, ugly sound. "Tomorrow, you're going to be standing in front of the most powerful people in the country, and you're going to look like a peasant. Don't say I didn't try to save you." Later that evening, after enduring 2 hours of passive-aggressive toasts, including one from Nihal, who pointedly welcomed Clara to the family. Despite our vast differences in upbringing, Clara finally escaped to her bridal suite. The room was massive, opulent, and suffocating. Clara walked over to the bed where her modest, weathered canvas garment bag lay flat. She unzipped it with trembling hands. Inside, protected by layers of acid-free archival tissue paper, was the dress. It was over 120 years old. It had been worn by her great-great-grandmother, a reigning sovereign of a European kingdom, for her own wedding in front of emperors and kings. It was woven from pure, unbleached mulberry silk, spun by hand in a convent in Bavaria. It was entirely bias-cut, designed to flow like water over the skin. To the untrained eye, it was painfully plain. There were no beads, no sequins, no heavy corsetry. It was simply a sheath of ivory silk that had naturally aged to a faint buttery cream. But if you looked closely, if you truly knew what you were looking at, the mastery was breathtaking. The hem was delicately embroidered with a technique lost to time, depicting the double-headed eagle and the royal crest of the House of Hesse in threads so fine they were nearly invisible unless caught by the light. And then there was the veil, carefully folded in a separate cedar box. The veil was a 10-foot cathedral-length masterpiece of antique Brussels lace. It had taken 40 lacemakers an entire year to create. Clara gently brushed her fingers over the silk. She wasn't just wearing a dress tomorrow, she was wearing her ancestors' resilience. Let Nihal scoff, let Céline mock. They were newly rich, obsessed with flaunting price tags because they had no heritage to stand on. Clara had bloodlines that predated the countries these people banked in. She carefully zipped the bag back up her anxiety, dissolving into a quiet, profound calm. Tomorrow the Karahans would get exactly what they asked for, a bride revealing her true colors. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and painfully clear. The Ocean Cliff estate was transformed into a botanical wonderland, dripping in tens of thousands of white orchids flown in from Colombia. A string quartet played Bach in the garden, while a small army of staff rushed around in panicked synchronicity. In the bridal suite, the atmosphere was freezing. Clara's bridesmaids, Emir's 2 cousins and Céline, forced upon her by Nihal, were draped in custom silk chiffon dresses. They had their makeup done by a celebrity artist Nihal had hired, sipping mimosas and completely ignoring Clara. "Are you sure you don't want to touch a bronzer, Clara?" Celine asked, lounging on a velvet sofa. "You look incredibly washed out. It's a very pale look for a very pale dress." "I'm fine, thank you," Clara said, pinning her hair back into a sleek, elegant chignon herself. She hadn't let Nihal's artist touch her. She wanted to look like herself. When the time came to put on the dress, the room fell silent. Clara slipped the century-old silk over her head. It settled against her skin, perfectly falling to the floor in a puddle of liquid ivory. It clung to her, subtly elegant and modest, with long fitted sleeves and a high boat neckline. It was severe in its simplicity. One of Emir's cousins snorted. She actually snorted, trying to cover it with a cough. "Wow, it's very vintage. It looks like a nightgown," Celine whispered loudly to the cousin. A Depression-era nightgown. Clara ignored them. She reached into the cedar box and carefully lifted the Brussels lace veil. She secured the heavy antique silver comb into her hair, letting the intricate lace cascade down her back, trailing miles behind her on the floor. The veil was a stark contrast to the plain dress, heavy with history and dizzying detail. A knock on the door signaled it was time. Clara walked out of the suite, her posture impossibly straight. The hallway was empty save for the wedding coordinator, who gave Clara a deeply sympathetic, almost pitying look. "Ready, Miss Hayes?" "I am," Clara said. She stood at the massive mahogany doors leading out to the grand lawn. Through the wood, she could hear the swell of the orchestra playing an opulent, sweeping march. She knew Emir was waiting at the end of the aisle. She took a deep breath, anchoring herself in the weight of the silk and the legacy of the women who had worn it before her. The heavy doors swung open. The sunlight hit Clara first, blinding and bright. Then the faces of the 300 guests came into view. They were seated on golden chairs, a sea of pastel fascinators, diamond necklaces, and bespoke suits. As Clara took her first step onto the white carpet, the expected hush of awe did not happen. Instead, a wave of visible confusion swept through the front rows, quickly followed by a rippling, undeniable murmur. It wasn't a whisper of admiration, it was a murmur of scandalized horror. "What is she wearing?" Clara heard a woman in the third row gasp, not bothering to lower her voice. "Good God, Nihal must be mortified." An older gentleman muttered, shaking his head. "It's literally a slip. Is she trying to insult them?" The cruelty was palpable. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Clara kept her eyes locked forward, refusing to look at the guests. She saw Nihal sitting in the front row, her face frozen in a mask of absolute, unadulterated fury. Nihal's knuckles were white as she gripped her evening bag, her eyes blazing with humiliation. She looked at Clara as if she were a piece of trash that had blown in from the street. Behind Nihal, Celine was openly smiling, whispering behind her hand to the woman next to her. Every step Clara took felt like walking through fire. The mocking stares, the disdainful sneers, the blatant disrespect, it was a gauntlet of upper-class cruelty. They saw a lack of crystals, a lack of heavy tulle, a lack of a recognizable designer logo, and they deemed her worthless. But then Clara looked at Emir. He was standing at the altar, looking devastatingly handsome in his tailored tuxedo. As she walked toward him, the murmurs and the mocking laughter of his family and friends seemed to wash over him, but he didn't care. His eyes were locked on Clara, wide and brimming with tears. He didn't see a cheap dress. He saw the woman he loved looking like an ethereal, timeless painting. Clara reached the altar. Emir gently took her hands, his thumbs brushing over her knuckles. "You look incredible," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, entirely oblivious to the venomous atmosphere his mother had cultivated behind him. "Thank you," Clara breathed. The officiant cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses nervously as the whispers finally began to die down to a simmer. "Dearly beloved," he began, "we are gathered here today." Clara stood tall. The ceremony was beautiful, the vows were genuine, but the tension in the audience was a coiled spring. The elite of Boaz were convinced they had just witnessed the ultimate social suicide. They were already drafting the text they would send the moment the reception began, eager to rip the poverty bride to shreds. They had no idea that the real event of the evening hadn't even started yet. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with. The reception was held in the estate's legendary Gilded Age ballroom, a space originally designed to mimic the Palace of Versailles. Above them, massive baccarat crystal chandeliers cast a warm, fractured light over tables draped in heavy silk brocade. The floral centerpieces were towering 6 feet tall cascades of white phalaenopsis, orchids, peonies, and imported hydrangeas. Waiters in immaculate white tailcoats moved seamlessly through the crowd carrying silver trays laden with beluga caviar blinis, truffled quail eggs, and endless flutes of vintage Dom Perignon. It was a display of wealth so astronomical, it bordered on the grotesque, specifically engineered by Nihal Karahan, to remind every single person in the room of their exact place in the social hierarchy, and at the very bottom of that hierarchy in the eyes of the Boaz elite was the bride. The cocktail hour was an exercise in pure endurance for Clara. As Emir was repeatedly pulled away by his father Orhan to talk shop with powerful investors and politicians, Clara was left stranded in a sea of hostile strangers. The social isolation was not accidental. It was a highly choreographed shunning. When Clara approached a group of women chatting near the ice sculpture, the conversation would abruptly halt. They would offer tight frozen smiles, look pointedly at her unembellished century-old silk dress, and find immediate excuses to walk away. I heard Nihal offered to buy her a custom Oscar de la Renta, and she actually refused. A woman in a heavily beaded Chanel suit whispered to her husband standing mere feet behind Clara, "It's a slap in the face. She's flaunting her poverty. It's practically a hostile act." Clara kept her chin high, sipping her sparkling water. She could feel the delicate weightless drag of the Brussels lace veil trailing behind her. It felt like a protective shroud. The real torment, however, began when they were seated for dinner. Nihal had strategically placed Clara at the head table, but seated Selina Kar directly across from her. It was an offensive maneuver meant to highlight the contrast. Selin, dripping in diamonds and wrapped in her custom crimson gown, looked like a movie star playing a villain. Clara, in her unbleached severe silk, looked like a ghost from a forgotten era. Halfway through the second course of butter-poached lobster, Nihal leaned over the table, her voice dropping to a harsh private register meant only for Clara's ears. "You look like a chambermaid," Nihal hissed, her smile never faltering for the photographers circling the room. "I spent 4 million TL on this wedding, Clara. 4 million TL to ensure my son had the event of the decade. And you have single-handedly turned it into a circus. People are asking me if we cut your budget so drastically that you had to resort to shopping at a flea market. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is for me?" "Nihal," Clara replied, her voice soft but completely steady, cutting through the older woman's venom. "I am sorry you feel embarrassed, but this dress means more to me than any modern couture. It is my history. Your history." Celine chimed in loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. She let out a peal of musical cruel laughter. "Clara, darling, what history? Your family rented an apartment in Boston. You work in a dusty library. Please don't try to romanticize a lack of funds. It's okay to admit you just couldn't afford anything else." The table fell silent. The wealthy guests seated nearby stopped chewing, their ears pricked, waiting for the bride to crumble. Emir, who had been deep in conversation with a bakan to his left, turned around, sensing the sudden drop in temperature. "What's going on?" Emir asked, his brow furrowing as he looked from his mother's sneer to Selin's triumphant smirk. "Nothing, darling," Selin purred, lifting her champagne glass. "We were just admiring Clara's thriftiness. It takes a lot of bravery to wear something so remarkably plain to an event like this. In fact, I think it calls for a toast." Before Emir could stop her, Selin stood up, tapping her spoon against her crystal flute. The sharp ringing echoed through the cavernous ballroom, bringing the low hum of conversation to an immediate halt. 300 faces turned toward the head table. "If I may," Selin projected her voice flawlessly, playing the role of the gracious friend to perfection. "I want to raise a glass to the happy couple, to Emir, a man who has always possessed a remarkably charitable heart. From rescuing stray dogs as a boy to, well, taking in those who have far less, he has always loved a project." A few muffled snickers erupted from the younger hedge fund crowd in the back. Emir's jaw tightened dangerously, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "And to Clara," Celine continued, her eyes locking onto the bride with predatory glee, "who has shown us all today that you don't need a designer label or expensive fabrics or even basic modern styling to walk down the aisle. You just need sheer audacity. To Clara and Emir, may your differences never tear you apart. It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive humiliation. The room raised their glasses in an uncomfortable whispering toast. Clara sat perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask. She didn't cry. She didn't flush with embarrassment. She simply picked up her glass and took a slow, elegant sip. Let them laugh, she thought. Let them dig their graves as deep as they possibly could. The dinner service eventually transitioned into the dancing portion of the evening. The 1-2-piece orchestra struck up a lively waltz, and the guests flooded the marble dance floor. Clara stood near the balcony doors, desperately needing a breath of fresh, salt-tinged air from the Bosphorus. Nihal and Céline, sensing blood in the water, approached her once again. "Clara." "Nihal," said her voice dripping with fake concern as she flanked the bride. "The photographer wants to do the solo bridal portraits in 10 minutes. I have my assistant waiting upstairs with the Vera Wang dress Céline so graciously offered. It will only take 5 minutes to change. If you do this, I will pretend this horrifying ceremony never happened." "I am not changing, Nihal," Clara said firmly. "My dress is staying on." "Oh, for heaven's sake, Clara, look at it," Céline snapped, dropping the polite act entirely. She reached out and grabbed the delicate sleeve of Clara's dress. "It's practically yellowed. It looks like it's going to disintegrate. It's embarrassing to look at. Do not touch that fabric." A deep, sharply accented voice echoed behind them. The three women turned. Standing there was a tall, silver-haired man in his late 60s. He wore an impeccably tailored, bespoke, midnight blue tuxedo that made the rest of the men in the room look like they were wearing rented suits. He possessed an aura of such absolute, undeniable authority that even Nihal instinctively took a step back. This was Dr. Henrik von Fürsten. He was not a Boas local. He was a wealthy European aristocrat, a senior board member of the Louvre, the chief consultant for the Met Costume Institute, and one of the most foremost historical appraisers in the world. He was attending the wedding solely because Orhan Karahan's firm was aggressively trying to secure a billion-dollar merger with von Fürsten's European banking syndicate. He was the most important guest in the room, and Orhan had spent the entire evening kissing his feet. Dr. von Fürsten completely ignored Nihal and Céline. His piercing blue eyes were locked entirely on Clara. More specifically, they were locked on her dress. His face, usually a mask of stoic boredom at these Istanbul society events, was pale and utterly transfixed. "May I?" Dr. von Fürsten asked, his voice barely a whisper, trembling with an emotion that looked entirely like reverence. Clara, recognizing the profound respect in his eyes, nodded gently. "You may." The historian stepped forward. He didn't touch the silk with his bare hands. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a pair of thin white cotton inspection gloves, the kind archivists use for priceless artifacts. He slipped them on and gingerly, as if handling spun glass, lifted the edge of Clara's long lace veil. Nihal let out a bewildered scoff. "Dr. von Fürsten, please don't trouble yourself with that old rag. My daughter-in-law was just about to go upstairs and change into something more appropriate." "Silence!" Dr. von Fürsten snapped, not even looking at Nihal. The word cracked like a whip. Nihal's mouth snapped shut in utter shock. No one spoke to Nihal Karahan like that. Dr. von Fürsten pulled a small jeweler's loop from his pocket, holding it to his eye as he examined the microscopic weave of the Brussels lace. He traced the invisible threadwork along the hem of the silk, his breathing growing shallow. He examined the high neckline, the bias cut, and the faint, almost ghostly embroidery of the double-headed eagle. When he finally lowered the loop, there were actual tears welling in the old man's eyes. "Gott, I am Himmel," he breathed, taking a staggering step back. He looked at Clara, his expression a mixture of awe and bewilderment. "It cannot be, but it is." The tension of the thread, the Bavarian convent seal woven into the inner seam. This is Pont de Gaz Las from 1894. "This is not just a dress." "Of course it's just a dress," Céline interrupted, clearly agitated that the spotlight had shifted to an old man inspecting the hemline. "It's a cheap vintage find. She probably got it off an online auction." Dr. von Fürsten finally turned his gaze upon Céline. The look of utter disdain he gave her was so powerful it could have frozen the Bosphorus outside. "You foolish, ignorant child," Dr. von Fürsten said, his voice carrying the chilling weight of absolute authority. The music seemed to quiet around them as nearby guests, sensing the drama, began to eavesdrop. You stand in the presence of one of the greatest lost artifacts of European history, and you call it cheap as seer. He turned back to the crowd that was beginning to form a circle around them. Orhan Karahan, seeing his most vital business prospect causing a scene, rushed over, panic in his eyes. "Henrik, is everything all right?" Orhan asked nervously. "Has Clara offended you?" "Offended me?" Dr. von Fürsten laughed, a booming, disbelieving sound. "Orhan, you and your wife have been parading around this evening, acting as though this young woman is beneath you. You flaunt your crystals and your leased yachts. But do you have any idea what your daughter-in-law is wearing?" Nihal crossed her arms, defensive and angry. "It is an old dress from her grandmother, a nobody." "You? A nobody?" Dr. von Fürsten repeated the words, tasting like poison in his mouth. He pointed a white-gloved finger at the gown. This dress was woven in 1894 for the royal wedding of Princess Irene of Hesse and by Rhine, the sister of Tsarina Alexandra of Russia. It was thought to have been destroyed in a fire during the uprisings in the 1920s. It is a masterpiece of textile history. If this gown were to be placed on the auction block at Sotheby's tomorrow, it would open at no less than 12 million TL. But it would never be auctioned, because it belongs in a museum behind bulletproof glass. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The clinking of glasses stopped. The orchestra faltered to a halt. The silence that descended was absolute, deafening, and suffocating. Celine's face drained of all color, her jaw slackening. 1.2 million? She stammered, looking at the simple ivory silk as if it had suddenly turned into solid gold. Nihal looked like she had been physically struck. "That's impossible." "You're mistaken, Dr. von Fürsten. She's Clara Hayes. She works in a library. She's lying to you. It's a replica." "I do not make mistakes regarding European antiquities, Mrs. Karahan," Dr. von Fürsten said coldly. "And one cannot replicate a 200-year-old Bavarian royal crest woven with extinct silkworms." He slowly turned back to Clara. The puzzle pieces in his mind were shifting, aligning with terrifying precision. He looked at her facial structure, the high aristocratic cheekbones, the sharp piercing grey eyes, the straight regal nose. The dress was a never destroyed. Dr. von Fürsten whispered, staring at Clara as if seeing a ghost. "It was smuggled out by the direct line when the Grand Duchess Adelheid fled to America in the dead of night." Clara held his gaze. She didn't flinch. She gave him a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. Dr. von Fürsten's breath hitched. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The ballroom was paralyzed. 300 of Istanbul's wealthiest elites watched in stunned silence. As the foremost expert in European history stood trembling before the bride they had spent the entire weekend mercilessly mocking. "You," Dr. von Fürsten's voice broke. He took a deliberate step back, giving Clara a wide berth, and then, to the absolute horror and confusion of everyone in the room, he bowed. It was not a polite nod. It was a deep, formal, court-sanctioned bow, bending at the waist, a gesture of ultimate subservience reserved only for a reigning monarch or highest nobility. "Your Serene Highness, Doctor," von Fürsten said clearly, his voice echoing off the baccarat crystals. Nihal let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. "What are you doing, Henrik? Stop this nonsense. Have you lost your mind? She's Clara Hayes, Doctor." Von Fürsten straightened up, his eyes flashing with a righteous historical fury. He turned to face Nihal Orhan and the crowd of gaping billionaires. "Her name is not Clara Hayes," Dr. von Fürsten announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "The woman standing before you is Her Serene Highness, Princess Clara of the House of Hesse-Darmstadt. She is the direct, legitimate granddaughter of the late Grand Duchess Adelheid. She carries the bloodline of Queen Victoria and the Romanovs. She is by every law of European genealogy, royalty." A woman in the second row actually fainted, her champagne glass shattering on the marble floor. The sound snapped the trance, sending a shockwave of frantic, panicked whispering through the room. "Royalty?" Celine choked out, clutching her crimson dress, her eyes wide with sheer panic. She lives in a rented apartment. She drives a Honda, because her family chose peace over power." Dr. von Fürsten retorted sharply. "They abandoned their titles to escape assassination and war. They integrated into your country to live quietly. But blood does not dilute, Miss Akar. And true nobility does not need to scream for attention by wearing a 25 TL crystal costume. Nihal Karahan was physically shaking. The woman who had spent her entire life climbing the social ladder, stepping on anyone she deemed beneath her, had just realized she had spent the last year bullying a literal princess. The mother-in-law, who had called the bride a chambermaid, was now staring at a woman whose ancestors had commanded empires. Clara Emir stepped forward, pushing past his frozen parents. He looked at his wife, his eyes searching her face. He wasn't angry. He was astonished. "Is it true?" Clara finally spoke. Her voice was calm, melodic, and carried the quiet power of generations of rulers. "My grandmother taught me that titles are just ghosts, Emir," Clara said gently, reaching out to take his hands. "She taught me that a person's worth is measured by their kindness, their intellect, and their character. Not their bank account, not their bloodline. I hid my name because I wanted to be loved for who I am, not what I am, and you did love me, Emir. You loved Clara Hayes." Emir squeezed her hands tightly, a massive, proud smile breaking across his face. "I love you, Clara, whoever you are." Clara then turned her gaze to Nihal. The older woman shrank back under the sheer weight of Clara's stare. There was no anger in Clara's eyes, which somehow made it worse. There was only a cold, profound pity. "Nihal," Clara said, her voice echoing perfectly in the silent room. "You spent this entire weekend, this entire year trying to make me feel small. You judged me for my simple clothes, my modest job, and my lack of trust funds. You invited Celine here to humiliate me. You allowed your friends to mock my grandmother's legacy. You thought you held all the power because you have money." Nihal opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to backtrack, but no words came out. She was entirely stripped of her armor. "Wealth can be acquired, Nihal," Clara continued, stepping closer. The 12 million TL silk pulled flawlessly around her feet. "It can be won, it can be lost, it can be married into, but class, grace, history, you cannot buy those things. And you have proven tonight that despite your billions, you possess absolutely none of them." Celine, trying to salvage any shred of dignity, took a step backward, trying to melt into the crowd. Clara didn't even look at her. Celine was a fly buzzing against the window pane, completely irrelevant. Orhan Karahan, sweating profusely, realized the catastrophic implications of what had just happened. He had not only deeply insulted his new daughter-in-law, but he'd likely just lost the billion-dollar merger with von Fursten's syndicate, who was looking at him with absolute disgust. "Your Highness," Orhan stammered, stepping forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Clara, please. We had no idea. If you had just told us." "If I had told you," Clara interrupted smoothly, "you would have paraded me around like a show pony. You would have used my family's name to boost your firm's prestige. You would have treated me with a fake obsequious respect, just as you are doing right now. I wanted a family, Orhan, not a boardroom. And unfortunately, you have shown me exactly who you are when you think no one of importance is watching." Dr. von Fursten stepped to Clara's side, offering his arm with impeccable grace. "If your Highness wishes, I have a private car waiting outside. The atmosphere here has become exceedingly vulgar." Clara looked at Emir. "Are you coming with me, or are you staying with them?" Emir didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He turned his back on his mother, his father, and the 300 gaping, terrified billionaires. He walked over to Clara, gently placing his hand on the small of her back. "I'm with you," Emir said firmly. "Always." Together, the three of them turned and began to walk toward the exit of the grand ballroom. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. No one dared to speak. The only sound in the massive, opulent room was the soft, rhythmic rustling of the priceless 1,894 Bavarian silk dragging across the marble floor, leaving the ruined, humiliated Boaz elite in its wake. The interior of Dr. Henrik von Fursten's chauffeured Maybach was a sanctuary of absolute silence, a stark and jarring contrast to the chaotic, hyperventilating ballroom they had just abandoned. The heavy soundproof doors sealed with a definitive click, cutting off the frantic shouts of Orhan Karahan, who had chased them all the way to the gravel driveway, his tuxedo jacket flapping wildly in the coastal wind. Clara sank into the plush leather seating, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation finally beginning to ebb. She felt a sudden crushing weight of exhaustion. The 12 million TL silk of the 1,894 gown settled around her like a protective shield, the faint scent of ancient cedar and dried roses filling the confined space of the luxury vehicle. For a long moment, no one spoke. The driver smoothly navigated the winding oceanside roads of Boaz, leaving the glowing monolithic Boaz Cliff estate behind them in the rearview mirror. Emir sat beside Clara, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, staring out the window into the pitch-black Bosphorus night. He looked entirely shell-shocked. His entire world, the foundation of his family's empire, and his understanding of the woman he loved, had just been violently upended in the span of 20 minutes. Clara reached out, her fingers gently touching his arm. "Emir, I am so sorry." He turned to look at her, his eyes tracing the severe aristocratic lines of her face, seeing her truly for the first time. The quiet archivist from Boston was gone. In her place sat a woman whose poise had brought a room full of the world's most powerful people to their knees. "Sorry?" Emir echoed, his voice rough with emotion. He let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. "Clara, you have absolutely nothing to apologize for. My family, my mother, God, the things they said to you, the way they treated you, and you just took it. You took all of it knowing the entire time that you held a hand that could completely destroy them. Why didn't you say anything sooner? Why didn't you defend yourself? Because if I had defended myself with my title, I would be no better than them," Clara said softly, her grey eyes holding his steady gaze. "I would be using an accident of birth to assert dominance. That is not who I am, Emir. My grandmother, Grand Duchess Adelheid, stripped herself of everything, her palaces, her jewels, her country, just to survive. She taught me that true power is not making others feel small. It is remaining steadfast in your own worth when others try to diminish you. I wanted to see if your family could love Clara Hayes, the woman with nothing. Tonight, they gave me their definitive answer." Emir swallowed hard, a profound sense of shame for his family washing over him. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, careful not to crush the fragile antique lace of her veil. "I'm so incredibly proud to be your husband, title or no title. But, Clara, we can't go back. You know that, right? After what happened in that room, my father is going to go scorched earth. They are going to spin this. They're going to try to ruin you." From the front passenger seat, Dr. von Fursten turned around, his silver hair catching the passing streetlights. His expression was not one of concern, but of cold, calculated anticipation. "Let them try, Emir, Doctor," von Fursten said, his heavy European accent carrying a chillingly calm authority. "Your parents operate under the delusion that wealth equates to untouchability. They are newly rich, swimming in a very small pond. They do not comprehend the true architecture of global power. By tomorrow morning, Orhan Karahan will realize he has not just insulted a bride, he has insulted a bloodline that is deeply, intrinsically connected to the oldest financial institutions and sovereign wealth funds in the world." Back at the Boaz Cliff estate, the Gilded Age ballroom had devolved into a scene of absolute, unmitigated pandemonium. The immediate aftermath of Clara's departure was not characterized by loud arguments, but by a frantic, suffocating. The social hierarchy of Boaz was incredibly delicate, built entirely on perception and proximity to power. Tonight, Nihal and Orhan Karahan had publicly, mercilessly humiliated a woman who was just revealed to be European royalty, while simultaneously alienating the exact man, Dr. von Fursten, who controlled the billion-dollar syndicate Orhan needed to save his over-leveraged equity firm. Nihal stood frozen near the head table, her face ashen, her breathing shallow and rapid. The women who had been fawning over her mere hours ago were now actively backing away, as if Nihal's very presence was contagious. The whispers were no longer hidden. They were loud, venomous, and entirely directed at her. Did you hear what she called her? A chambermaid. A prominent Bakan's wife hissed to a group of onlookers, her eyes fixed on Nihal with undisguised, gleeful disgust. She forced the Princess of Hesse to sit across from her son's ex-girlfriend and mocked her heritage. "It is the most spectacularly vulgar thing I have ever witnessed. Orhan is finished." A hedge fund manager muttered, already furiously typing on his phone to instruct his brokers for the Monday morning market opening. If von Fürsten pulls the syndicate deal, which he absolutely will, Karahan Holding is going to default on their leveraged buyouts. The firm is a house of cards. I need to liquidate my positions immediately. A sound some Selina K, realizing that the tide had violently turned, attempted to perform a desperate act of social triage. She spotted a group of influential socialites whispering near the ice sculpture and hurried over plastering on a fake sympathetic smile. It's just awful, isn't it? Selin tried to interject, her voice trembling slightly. How were we supposed to know she was so deceitful, hiding her true identity like that? It's practically entrapment. The group of women turned to stare at Celine. The silence was absolute and freezing. The lead socialite, a woman whose family had funded the original construction of the Boaz mansions, looked Celine up and down with an expression of pure unadulterated contempt. Celine, the woman said, her voice dripping with ice, you stood on a chair and publicly toasted to a royal bride's thriftiness because you were jealous that she secured a ring and you did not. You are a crass, cruel, and deeply embarrassing woman. Do not ever speak to me again. The women turned their backs simultaneously, forming an impenetrable wall of silk and diamonds. Celine's face crumpled. In less than 60 seconds, she had been entirely excised from the only world she cared about. She was a pariah. Orhan Karahan, sweating profusely and clutching his chest as if staving off a myocardial infarction, finally managed to corner his chief public relations officer, a ruthless fixer named David. David, you need to get ahead of this. Orhan barked, spit flying from his lips. Call page 6. Call the Wall Street Journal. Leak a story that Clara is a fraud. Tell them von Fürsten is senile. Say she forged the historical documents. Do whatever it takes. But kill this story before the markets open on Monday. David looked at his boss, his expression grim and completely devoid of the usual sycophantic deference. He slowly shook his head. Orhan, I can't do that, David said quietly. What do you mean you can't do that? I pay you 3 million TL a year to control the narrative. Control it? You don't understand who you're dealing with, David replied, pulling out his tablet and showing the screen to Orhan. It's already over. Orhan stared at the glowing screen. It was a live feed of Dr. von Fürsten's private institutional Twitter account, an account followed by every major financial journalist, central banker, and sovereign wealth manager on the planet. The tweet was simple, elegant, and entirely lethal. Tonight, it was my profound honor to verify the survival of the 1,894 royal wedding silk of the House of Hesse, worn with unparalleled grace by Her Serene Highness Princess Clara. It is a tragedy that such regal dignity was met with the gross, uncultured vulgarity of Karahan Holding's leadership. Effective immediately, the von Fürsten syndicate is withdrawing all financial considerations, negotiations, and associations with Orhan Karahan and his entities. We do not do business with those devoid of honor. Orhan's tablet slipped from his trembling hands, shattering on the marble floor. The sound echoed through the rapidly emptying ballroom. His empire was dead. By Monday morning, the financial and social execution of the Karahan family was televised, digitized, and absolute. The story had ignited like a wildfire in a dry, clear-throat forest. The media dubbed her the undercover princess, and the narrative was irresistible. A cruel nouveau riche family relentlessly bullies a modest, humble bride, only to discover they were humiliating a literal European royal wearing a 12 million TL museum artifact. It was the ultimate Cinderella story, inverted and weaponized. When the Borsa Istanbul opened at 9:30 a.m., Karahan Holding did not just drop. It plummeted in a spectacular historic freefall. Institutional investors, spooked by von Fürsten's public condemnation and terrified of being associated with the PR nightmare, initiated massive sell-offs. By noon, Karahan Holding had lost 40% of its market capitalization. Lenders began calling in their margin loans, exposing the firm's dangerous over-leveraging. Orhan Karahan was trapped in his glass-walled Istanbul office, watching his life's work evaporate on the ticker tape, entirely powerless to stop the bleeding. But the financial ruin was only half of the punishment. The social exile was far more agonizing, especially for Nihal. Nihal had spent decades cultivating a flawless image as a pillar of high society. She sat on the boards of museums, chaired charity galas, and dictated the social calendar of the East Coast elite. By Tuesday afternoon, she had received couriered letters from every single board she sat on, politely but firmly requesting her immediate resignation. Her country club memberships were suddenly under review. When she tried to book her usual table at Le Bernardin to project an image of normalcy, the maître de coulis informed her that they were fully booked for the next 6 months. She was experiencing the exact isolation she had tried to force upon Clara, but magnified by 1,000. Desperation bred irrationality, and Nihal, cornered and panicking, decided to execute a maneuver so wildly out of touch that it bordered on clinical insanity. She decided she was going to confront Clara and force her to issue a public apology to save the Karahan name. On Wednesday morning, Nihal ordered her driver to take her to Clara's modest apartment in Boston. She did not call ahead. She arrived in a dark SUV, wearing a stark black Chanel suit and oversized sunglasses, looking like a woman attending a funeral. She marched up the steps of the brownstone, her heels clicking aggressively against the concrete, and pounded on the door. After a few moments, the heavy wooden door opened. Clara stood there, dressed in simple faded denim jeans and an oversized comfortable grey cashmere sweater. She looked entirely relaxed, holding a mug of tea, her hair pulled back in a messy clip. She looked at Nihal without a trace of surprise, anger, or fear. She just looked mildly inconvenienced. "Clara," Nihal demanded, pushing her sunglasses up onto her head, her voice sharp and desperate. "We need to talk. Right now." Clara did not step aside to let her in. She simply stood in the doorway, an immovable force. "Hello, Nihal. What can I do for you? What can you do for me?" Nihal hissed, looking around the modest street as if the air itself was contaminating her. "You can stop this. You can call off your attack dogs. Dr. von Fursten is destroying Orhan's company. My friends won't return my phone calls. We are being crucified in the press. You need to release a statement immediately. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we welcomed you. You owe us that much." Clara took a slow sip of her tea, the steam curling into the crisp autumn air. She looked at Nihal with that same terrifyingly calm pity she had displayed in the ballroom. "I owe you nothing, Nihal," Clara said smoothly. "And I do not have attack dogs. I haven't spoken to a single journalist. I haven't released a single statement. I've simply gone back to my life." "Then why is this happening?" Nihal shrieked, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering completely. "Because actions have consequences," Clara replied, her voice remaining quiet and utterly lethal. "You spent an entire year showing the world exactly who you are. You paraded your cruelty as a badge of honor. You thought your wealth shielded you from basic human decency. Dr. von Fursten didn't destroy your husband's company. Your husband's complete lack of integrity destroyed his company. The press isn't attacking you. They're simply reporting on what you chose to do in a room full of 300 witnesses." Nihal's face contorted in a mixture of rage and sheer panic. "You planned this? You wore that pathetic ragged dress on purpose to set us up?" "I wore my grandmother's wedding dress because I loved her and I loved my history," Clara corrected her gently, though her eyes were hardened steel. "You chose to mock it. You chose to try and humiliate me. I simply allowed you to dig your own grave. I didn't push you in, Nihal. You jumped." Nihal opened her mouth, a vicious insult sitting on her tongue, but before she could speak, a shadow fell over the doorway. Emir stepped up behind Clara, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. He looked at his mother, his expression entirely devoid of the familial warmth that used to reside there. "Anne," Emir said, his voice heavy with finality, "you need to leave. Now." "Emir, please," Nihal pleaded, shifting tactics, trying to summon tears. "Your father is losing everything. They are talking about federal audits. You have to come back to the firm. You have to talk some sense into your wife." "She is not my wife right now. She is a woman you relentlessly abused," Emir replied coldly. "And I am not coming back to the firm. I submitted my formal resignation to the board this morning. I will not be associated with a company or a family that operates with such profound moral bankruptcy." Nihal staggered back as if physically struck. "You're abandoning us for her?" "No," Emir said quietly. "I'm abandoning you for myself because I finally see what you turned me into and I refuse to be that man anymore. Do not come here again, Anne. If you do, I will have you trespassed." Emir gently pulled Clara back inside and shut the heavy wooden door. the deadbolt clicking into place with a sound of absolute finality. Nihal stood alone on the concrete stoop of a Boston brownstone, surrounded by the deafening silence of her ruined empire. She had no leverage. She had no power. She had millions of TL in her bank account. But in the grand sweeping theater of the world, she was entirely, utterly bankrupt. As she stumbled back to her waiting SUV, she checked her phone, a desperate habit she couldn't break. The top trending article on her newsfeed was about Selena Carr. Celine's boutique public relations firm had just been dropped by its 3 largest clients, all citing a desire to distance themselves from her toxic social behavior displayed at the Karahan wedding. The article featured a highly unflattering paparazzi photo of Celine crying outside a coffee shop. Nihal locked her phone and stared out the tinted window as the car pulled away. They had tried to break a princess for sport, and the princess had broken them simply by letting them speak. 6 months later, the chilling winds of the Boaz coast had given way to the soft blooming warmth of late spring, but the landscape of the elite had been irrevocably altered. The Karahan holding implosion had become a textbook case study in corporate hubris, facing federal audits regarding their leveraging practices and abandoned by every major institutional investor. Orhan Karahan was forced into an aggressive restructuring. To satisfy their creditors and avoid criminal negligence charges, the Karahans had to liquidate their most prized personal assets. The crown jewel of their liquidation was the Boaz Cliff estate, the very venue where they had sealed their doom. In a twist of poetic justice so profound it felt scripted, the estate was quietly purchased by a European historical trust at a heavily discounted fire sale price. The trust, funded by a coalition of European nobility and directed by Dr. Henrik von Fürsten, immediately began transforming the sprawling mansion into a public museum dedicated to the preservation of immigrant history and displaced European artifacts. The Karahans were forced to move into a generic upscale condominium in Connecticut, functionally exiled from the society they had once ruthlessly governed. Nihal, unable to bear the whispers and the pitying stares, practically became a recluse, spending her days obsessively scrolling through society blogs that no longer mentioned her name. Clara and Emir, conversely, had never sought the spotlight, but they utilized the massive, unavoidable platform they had been handed with surgical precision. Clara did not suddenly start wearing tiaras, or demanding to be called Your Highness in daily life. She remained the quiet, fiercely intelligent archivist she had always been. However, she recognized the power her true name now held, and she used it as a master key to unlock doors that had previously been welded shut. With the intense global interest in her story, Clara established the Adelheid Foundation named after her grandmother. The foundation was dedicated to funding the restoration of lost cultural artifacts and providing massive grants to underfunded public libraries and historical archives across the United States. Emir, utilizing his extensive financial background, but stripped of his family's toxic corporate culture, took over as the chief financial officer of the foundation, managing its rapidly expanding endowment. Their true triumph, however, occurred on a rainy Tuesday evening in early May at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. The Met Costume Institute was unveiling its highly anticipated spring exhibition, Threads of Sovereignty, the Lost Textiles of European Royalty. The event was heavily guarded, exclusive, and breathtakingly elegant. The guest list included actual reigning monarchs, prominent historians, and the most respected names in global philanthropy. Notably absent were anyone resembling the Karahans or Selena Carr. Clara and Emir walked through the echoing marble halls, their hands intertwined. Clara wore a sleek, modern, emerald green gown, elegant, understated, and entirely devoid of the ostentatious crystals Nihal had once tried to force upon her. Emir looked at her with a quiet, boundless adoration that had only deepened in the aftermath of the storm. Dr. von Fürsten met them at the entrance to the main gallery, his face lighting up with genuine warmth. He bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that Clara had finally stopped trying to wave away. Your Highness. Dr. von Fürsten smiled, his blue eyes crinkling. Emir, the exhibit is ready. I wanted you to be the first to see the centerpiece. He led them through the dimly lit climate-controlled labyrinth of the museum. The air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone and old paper. They turned a corner and entered the grand rotunda. In the absolute center of the room, elevated on a velvet-draped pedestal, and encased in a massive cylinder of glass, was the dress. It was beautifully mounted on a custom mannequin, expertly lit from below to highlight the microscopic, agonizingly perfect weave of the 1,894 unbleached mulberry silk. The ten-flesh Brussels lace veil was meticulously spread out behind it, cascading like a frozen waterfall of history. The faint embroidery of the double-headed eagle of the House of Hesse-Darmstadt seemed to glow under the strategic lighting. It did not look like a thrift store find. It did not look like a chambermaid slip. It looked exactly like what it was: a priceless, immortal artifact of human artistry and royal resilience. A small brass plaque at the base of the display read, "The Hesse-Darmstadt Royal Wedding Gown, 1894, woven by the Sisters of the Bavarian Convent, worn by Princess Irene of Hesse and by Rhine, preserved through exile by Grand Duchess Adelheid, generously on permanent loan from Her Serene Highness Princess Clara." Clara stepped up to the glass, her reflection ghosting over the ivory silk. She placed her hand against the cool surface, feeling the weight of the generations of women who had worn it, who had suffered in it, and who had survived because of the strength woven into their very DNA. "It looks exactly where it belongs," Emir whispered, standing right behind her, his chest a warm, solid presence against her back. "Yes," Clara agreed softly, a profound sense of peace settling over her spirit. "It finally does." She turned away from the dress, leaning into her husband's embrace. She didn't need the silk anymore to prove her worth. She didn't need the validation of a society obsessed with price tags. She had honored her ancestors, dismantled a dynasty built on cruelty, and built a life rooted entirely in authentic, undeniable truth. The Karahans had looked at Clara and seen a nobody, a blank canvas upon which they could project their arrogance and their power. But they had failed to realize a fundamental truth of history. You do not paint over a masterpiece. If you try, the paint will eventually peel, the illusion will inevitably crack, and the masterpiece will remain eternal and magnificent, waiting to be revealed to a world finally ready to understand its true value. The absolute devastation of the Karahan Empire is a masterclass in why you should never ever judge a book by its cover or a bride by her vintage dress. Clara's ability to remain composed while letting her arrogant in-laws completely destroy their own reputations is nothing short of legendary. From the epic financial fallout to the poetic justice of their estate becoming a museum, this story proves that true class always outshines superficial wealth. What did you think of Clara's ultimate revenge? Was Nihal's punishment justified? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you love this story of royal retribution and instant karma, please smash that like button, share this video with your friends who love a brilliant plot twist, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life drama stories. See you in the next one.